My name is Bruno Sade from brunosade.com. Today I want to talk about two ways of dealing with your triggers, what I call the external way and the internal way. But first of all, what is a trigger? A trigger is a stimulus, such as something that someone else says or does, that subconsciously activates a negative or an unpleasant or traumatic memory, and then generates an unwanted emotional or physiological reaction that you cannot fully control. Now, this emotional reaction might range from something relatively mild to something like a post-traumatic stress disorder flashback. In that last case, it would be advisable to deal with it with the help of a mental health professional. But let's say that an example of a trigger might be, in my case, when Argentina won the World Cup in December, the football World Cup. My girlfriend invited me to go outside to celebrate with the rest of the people in my city. And what I noticed when we got to the main street of the city I live in is that there was so many people. It was such a big crowd. Plus, it was also very noisy that I found myself feeling very uncomfortable and like I just wanted to get out of there. So I was triggered by the large crowd and by the very loud noises. So in terms of dealing with our triggers, first of all, it can be very useful to try to become aware of what our triggers are. And one way to become aware of them is to try to pay attention and ask ourselves what was happening right before I became distressed or right before I experienced an unpleasant emotion. What was going on? What was I seeing or hearing or sensing or even thinking? Some triggers can be activated by thought alone. Others need some sort of sensory input. And once we become more aware of what our triggers are, we can then find out ways to deal with them. So I talked about the external way and the internal way of dealing with our triggers. The external way would be basically to try to avoid running into them in the external world. So in my case, it might be something like if I know I'm triggered by large, noisy crowds, then I'm going to try not to go to places where there are loud, noisy crowds. For example, a nightclub. I might simply decide to avoid those type of environments. Or let's say that I'm triggered whenever my friends or my partner say that I'm selfish. I am triggered by that. So I would ask them not to say that to me. So basically, the external way is trying to somehow influence our environment so as not to run into the trigger, so as not to become exposed to the trigger. And the internal way, on the other hand, is to work on our internal reaction to the trigger. And EFT is one of the ways that we can do that. How do we use EFT to work on our triggers? With EFT, we want to come up with specific events, like specific times, recent or future, where that trigger is activated, where the trigger is at play, let's say. So I might, for example, if I were to work on this trigger of the loud, noisy crowds, I might come up with the future event of the next time I might encounter one of these triggers. Or it might be the recent experience I might tap on the memory of when Argentina won the World Cup. Or the other possibility is to work on some of the memories that I suspect are at the root or causing that to be a trigger for me in the first place. Let's imagine that maybe in my case, when I was a kid, I was with my parents in a crowded, noisy environment, and somehow I got separated from them for a few moments. And at the time, being a kid, I became very afraid, not being able to find my parents. And maybe that memory, which doesn't sound necessarily like a big deal to an adult, but for a kid, it had some sort of emotional impact for me at the time. And maybe that's one of the experiences that makes me feel triggered nowadays by loud, noisy crowds, because the triggers are basically like a conditioned response. It's like the survival part of the brain or the emotional part of the brain somehow learn to associate that certain stimulus, in this case, a loud, noisy crowd, equals some degree of danger or threat. And that's why it generates this unwanted emotional and physiological reaction. So the idea with EFT is that by tapping on these specific events, we can diminish and release our unpleasant emotional reactions to these memories and to these triggers so that we gain a higher degree of emotional freedom around them. So both the internal and the external way of dealing with our triggers involve some degree of work, because both the external way of trying to avoid the trigger or asking people not to trigger us by saying or doing certain things, it requires some work. Sometimes our environment does what we want, other times it doesn't. Sometimes people forget or they don't care enough for different reasons. Sometimes we can still get triggered, even if we intended to avoid becoming exposed to the trigger. It can somehow still find us. But the internal way of using EFT to work on our reactions to the trigger can also involve some degree of work. So depending on what kind of trigger it is, we might decide to simply try to avoid it or to work on it. In my case, for example, with this being triggered by loud, noisy crowds, I can simply decide to avoid them because fortunately I don't have to be in this type of environments very frequently. But let's say that I have a wedding coming up and I want to attend that wedding. And I know that in the wedding, there's going to be a loud, noisy crowd celebrating the wedding. And I want to have a good time at the wedding. Then in that case, I might decide to do the work to try to diminish or release my unpleasant emotional reactions to that trigger. And other times we might simply decide that's not necessary. I can simply try to avoid being triggered in the first place. So something important to say is that, like I usually say in my videos, if any of these memories or triggers are too intense, you feel like they might be too intense to work on your own, or maybe they were traumatic memories in the first place where you felt like your life was in danger. In that case, it's recommended not to work on them by yourself, but to do so with the help of a certified practitioner, such as myself or someone else. Otherwise, feel free to try tapping on some of your triggers, perhaps choose those that generate milder reactions as opposed to, like I said before, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is best worked with the help of a certified practitioner who's probably also a mental health licensed professional. So that's it for today. I hope this was useful, and I look forward to seeing you again in one of my next videos.